Good evening. I'm Isabella with the Engagement Department at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's virtual lecture, Inca Textiles Under Colonial Rule. We're so glad to have you joining us virtually, and we hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphones for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under View Options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we look forward to answering some of those at the end of this presentation. Closed captions are available and can be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. If you encounter any technical difficulties during today's program, again, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to assist you. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Andrew Hamilton. Andrew is an Associate Curator of Arts of the Americas here at the Art Institute. His work explores the art and architecture of the ancient and colonial Americas, with particular interest in the Andes and textiles, as well as contemporary Native American art. His first book, Scale and the Incas, which he also illustrated, was published by Princeton University Press in 2018. He is currently completing his second book, The Emperor's New Clothes, the biography of a royal Inca tunic. Andrew is also a lecturer in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. And now I will turn things over to Andrew. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning into my talk. Obviously, colonialism is a significant issue that affects art in a lot of ways. It has influenced artistic styles. It has determined where art is. My talk today will consider both the Incas' colonial subjugation of other indigenous communities and Spain's eventual conquest of the Inca Empire. With this in mind, it's important to acknowledge that because of settler colonialism, the Art Institute of Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes have also called this area home. And today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. As an institution, we are committed to supporting and celebrating indigenous artists, such as the many weavers who created the fragments of cloth that I'll discuss today. Museums have complex relationships with fragments. Greco-Roman sculptures are commonly exhibited as disembodied heads. Ceramics with missing pieces may be infilled and overpainted so that they appear more whole, while others might be visibly reconstructed from sherds, with portions still missing. Textiles, however, are more often exhibited if they're relatively complete. This poses challenges for the medium, as fibers are so susceptible to wear, to being torn and staining. These kinds of damage can be difficult to reverse or improve. Textiles with significant condition issues might never have the chance to go on view, both for aesthetic reasons and because the fragile fibers would further degrade with light exposure. On the other hand, some textile fragments have been elevated as an aid to industry, to inform and inspire weavers and cloth designers in the present. In such study collections, however, it can be difficult to imagine what the whole textile looked like or to understand its cultural context. As well, when textile fragments were collected for such purposes, institutions often only wanted one example of a particular design and sometimes sold off additional fragments of the same cloth as duplicates to other museums. Such textiles now exist in a state of distributed objecthood, a sort of art historical horcrux. To my mind, a humble textile fragment can have a lot to teach us, as but a morsel of cloth that has the power to focus and concentrate one's attention. Often it's only by examining the fabric's raw edges, perhaps still coming undone, that we have the opportunity to see how it was really made in the first place. From this, we might be able to work out the rules by which its warps and wefts interact, and extrapolate how continuations of its threads would have behaved. After establishing the nature of its motifs and how they form patterns, we might be able to reconstruct the repetition, and with enough knowledge of its type, perhaps even the textile as a whole. And while the wear and tear textiles can sustain might sometimes be visually detrimental, it's also a record of the cloth's being, its life history, and afterlife. Two textile fragments in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago capture my attention in just such a way. The intricately woven pieces manifest a bizarre life history. They were cut into very similar, enigmatic butterfly-like shapes. Each measures only about 10 inches by at most 17 inches. The Art Institute purchased them already in this state in 1924 from Sumner Healy Antiques in New York. They were likely acquired on account of their complex woven designs. Indeed, they were originally accompanied by a third fragment, also cut into this peculiar shape, but its composition more or less duplicated the one on the left, and it was in slightly worse condition, so we declined to purchase it. The former curator of the Textile Museum, Ann Rowe, first recognized that the third piece was eventually acquired by George Hewitt Myers sometimes after 1928 and entered the collection of the Textile Museum in 1940, now part of the George Washington University. The fragment's motifs suggest that they are the remains of a colonial Inca tunic. The Inca Empire developed along the spine of the Andes throughout the 1400s. From their capital of Cusco, they successively conquered communities throughout Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, eventually forming an empire that stretched from southern Colombia into central Chile and Argentina. Although subjects of the Inca Empire were required to continue wearing their diverse forms of regional dress, Inca men generally wore a large rectangular shirt called an unku in Quechua. However, these fragments have a more distinctive history. As I'll explain, their particular designs reveal that the tunic they were cut from was woven sometime after the invasion and protracted conquest of the Inca Empire by Spanish forces, which began in 1532, and eventually led to the creation of the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Inca royal court eventually retreated from Cusco to a jungle settlement at a lower elevation named Vilcabamba, where they were ultimately defeated in 1572. At present, it's hard to say exactly when the tunic was made, because scholarship has not yet reconstructed the evolution of indigenous fashions during the colonial period in a sufficiently fine-grained way. The Art Institute has long dated these fragments from the period from 1532 to 1700. The Textile Museum dates theirs to as late as 1821. Thus, in my talk today, I want to unpack these elusive fragments in our collection, which are currently on view in Gallery 136. What did the original garment look like? What does it tell us about Inca culture and art, especially as it reacted to colonial rule? And why was the tunic butchered in this extreme way? Because of what is missing, we'll have to work harder to understand the portions that remain. But the mental exercise of doing so will, I hope, force us to become more observant in inquiring of these objects' minute details, perhaps much more so than if the garment had just survived in its entirety, lulling us into passively admiring its form, and even allowing us to take it a little bit for granted. Indeed, this is in some ways what has happened to an older and more illustrious Inca period tunic, likely woven just before the Spanish invasion in 1532. It's key for developing our understanding of these more recent fragments because it's in many ways what inspired them. The garment is arguably the most famous work of Andean art in the world and the subject of a book I'm writing. Scholars often call it the Dumbarton Oaks tunic because it was acquired around 1950 by Robert Woods Bliss, the founder of the research institute Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., where it's still preserved today. However, it's more officially named the All-Takapu tunic because it's entirely covered in intricate motifs that Incas called takapus. You can already see that these are the same kinds of rectangular designs featured on one of the Art Institute fragments. What makes the Dumbarton Oaks tunic so important is that identical garments were depicted in 3 intricately related manuscripts created by a Basque Mercedarian friar named Martín de Murúa, an indigenous man named Felipe Huamopoma de Ayala, and other indigenous illustrators and the Viceroyalty of Peru between the 1580s and 1615. This style of unku is shown in 13 different illustrations and only ever being worn by Inca rulers called Sapa Incas. The garment prominently appears in the manuscript's royal portraits. Notably, the Incas never developed their own tradition of creating paintings or portraiture in a European sense. These colonial images were being invented by indigenous artists, emulating European court portraiture to retroactively substantiate their royal lineages. See how they compare to a portrait of Philip III by Pantoja de la Cruz. the full length, the turned foot, the 3/4 gaze, and the objects of power clutched in the hands. It seems likely that this style of tunic was chosen for the portraits because it was thought to appropriately reify the ruler's role. Other illustrations in the manuscript show how Inca rulers wearing this style, for example, while officiating a religious ceremony, at their own wedding, and even in death as a mummy. The evidence suggests that the Dumbarton Oaks tunic was the Inca's most significant style of royal regalia. It is the only royal Inca tunic or royal Inca object of any kind known to survive anywhere in the world, making it a powerful symbol of indigenous sovereignty. But one of the strange aspects of Felipe Wamapolo de Ayala's illustrations is that he drew many of the Takapus as numbers and letters, usually repeating in diagonal lines. His manuscript was the first of the three to be widely studied through a facsimile published in 1936. So it significantly shaped scholars' initial understandings of the Dumbarton Oaks tunic once it came to light in the 1950s. Since the textile is so complete and well preserved, a lot of scholarship has focused on trying to understand its overall composition and the nature of its motifs. Because it was thought that the Takapus should have repeated in diagonal lines, their more chaotic distribution created the suspicion that they could be a sort of code or writing system. Coupled with this, one of the tunic's Takapus takes the shape of another style of Inca Unku, which scholars have nicknamed checkerboard tunics. They made it seem like the Takapus could be a long-lost glyphic writing system. The notion perhaps seemed compelling because their gridded arrangement is superficially similar to Maya glyphs. However, all colonial texts, even ones by indigenous authors, agreed that the Incas never developed writing. Nonetheless, this sensational suggestion landed the tunic in the New York Times and Time magazine, and ever since, debates have raged over the motif's capacity for language. Now, these pipe dreams aside, colonial texts actually provide fairly straightforward knowledge of how Takapus were woven and worn during the Inca period. Weavers owed the Inca state an annual amount of labor. They could only produce Takapu clothing for the Sapa Inca himself, and he alone had the privilege of redistributing the garments. He gave Takapu clothing to individuals throughout the empire who had performed services for him, and they would have worn these garments as a sign of his favor. Tunics like the one at Dumbarton Oaks were the only ones completely covered with Takapus, and it makes sense that they were reserved for the emperor because they were hugely labor-intensive to weave. Most tunics had smaller quantities of Takapus, usually just a few rows at the waist, and with a limited number of designs that were woven in repetition. In my studies of these garments, it seems that tunics with fewer Takapus were often less finely woven, indicating that quality played a key role in signification. Indeed, one of the most basic styles of imperial tunics only had diamond patterns at the waist. While some were quite well made, others were fairly rudimentary. In spite of this, because the recipient of a Takapu garment only gained the right to wear it for the lifespan of the cloth and could not pass it on to their descendants, people often cut waistbands out from worn-out garments, sewed the two sides together, and saved them so that they could be included in their burials. Even the most basic Takapu garment was clearly among a person's most prized possessions. What this system of creating and distributing Takapu clothing created was, in essence, something like a state-controlled fashion statement, hyping Inca imperial rule. The Sapa Inca wore a garment entirely composed of motifs that all his subjects wore in much smaller quantities. By wearing them, it's as if he was embodying the empire itself. Indeed, Spaniards came to understand Takapus as similar to heraldry, and an inventory in the collection of Philip II, completed upon his death in 1598, described a royal Inca tunic as covered in the señales de armas de provincias que el Inca posea, or the signs or crests of the provinces that the Sapa Inca possessed. Because Takapus are so foreign to us, it might be helpful to consider what this could look like to American eyes. In this image of an American president, the state flags of the United States are united across his body. While Takapus probably didn't represent specific states within the Inca Empire, we can get a sense of how, when the Sapa Inca wore such motifs, he could come to sartorially represent his empire. But in the way I interpret the Dumbarton Oaks tunic's designs, the other essential element is the reduced scale checkerboard tunics. Remarkably, an eyewitness account of these incus survives from the pivotal first meeting of Spanish and Inca forces at Cajamarca in 1532. As Atahualpa approached the Spaniards, Pizarro's secretary, Francisco de Jerez, observed that the squadron of soldiers in front of his litter were vestidos de librea a manera de escajes, or dressed in a livery in the manner of a checkerboard. This suggests that checkerboard tunics were the uniforms of the Inca Imperial Guard. In the Royal Inca tunic, I don't believe they're a glyph with a linguistic or phonetic capacity, but I do believe they operate as a symbol. If we look at both sides, we can see that the reduced scale checkerboard tunics were the most numerous motif. Moreover, of the 312 squares within the garment, the 33 checkerboard tunics occupy, are next to, or are diagonal from 247 of the spaces. The emperor's guards infiltrate the other Takapus, connecting them and also exerting power over them. This is just how his actual armies wearing these tunics united the Takapu-clad nobles of his empire. In this way, I believe the Dumbarton's tunics makes a sartorial statement of Inca imperial power. To loyal subjects of the empire, this was an assurance of military protection. Inca armies were never far away. But to those contemplating dissension, it might have served as a sobering warning that these same armies were always within striking distance. We can imagine what a powerful visual statement the addition of the military tunics would have made. Once a patriotic red and blue, the president's suit is colored by green and brown camouflage, and not only chromatically. We're confronted by a garment befitting a divine right emperor whose physical body is made the reduced scale embodiment of an ever-expanding militaristic empire. Now, after the Spanish invasion began, it's unclear how quickly all Takapu tunics may have stopped being woven. Wamon Poma de Ayala's illustrations indicate that these garments were worn well into the colonial period by the puppet rulers instated by the Spanish viceroys. But these may have been heirloom vestments that survived from Inca times. Here, Wamon Poma drew the ruler Sayri Tupac wearing an Alta Capa tunic in 1558, when he met with Viceroy Andrés Hurtado de Mendoza in Lima and ultimately abandoned his claim to the Inca throne. Curiously, however, Wamon Poma collaborated with Martín de Murúa on the earlier Galvan Murúa and was responsible for the same image in the earlier manuscript, in which he dressed Sayri Tupac in a more basic tunic. The same phenomenon also transpired in another set of illustrations. In his own manuscript, Wamon Poma de Ayala depicted Tupac Amaru, the last Sapa Inca, wearing an Alta Capa tunic when he was captured in 1572. But when Wamon Poma de Ayala created an earlier version of the illustration in the Galvan Murúa, he portrayed Tupac Amaru in a more basic Takapu waistband tunic. These costume changes suggest that in his own manuscript, Felipe Wamon Poma de Ayala was intentionally upgrading the garments of the Sapa Incas to Alta Capa tunics, especially in illustrations where the future of the Inca crown was at stake, as visual assertions of indigenous sovereignty. But these colonial illustrations of Alta Capa tunics also show how the style came to be sartorially deposed. For example, an illustration created by an unknown artist and possibly Martín de Murúa depicted the entire line of Inca succession simultaneously. A Sapa Inca in an Alta Capa tunic is at the center of the composition, likely representing Viracocha or Tupac Inca Yupanqui. Other rulers surround him, dressed in the lesser tunics that they wore in their individual portraits. The illustration takes as its model European paintings like this allegory of the Tudor succession, and essentially creates a visual hierarchy of royal Inca dress. When Wamon Poma de Ayala redrew this image, however, he preserved its composition, but made its meaning less esoteric. His drawing simply shows an Inca ruler surrounded by his royal council, although it nonetheless affirms the importance of Alta Capa tunics. However, it's precisely this prioritization of the tunic that makes the next image in his manuscript so audacious. One turns the page to find that Wamon Poma redrew the composition, but this time placed himself at the center, pushing the venerated Inca ruler in an Alta Capa tunic to the side. The illustration was meant to depict Wamon Poma conducting research for his manuscript, especially querying former rulers, but its sartorial commentary is perhaps more conspicuous. Notice how in the second image, he drew the tecapus on the tunic larger and less finely woven than in the previous one. He also shrouded the old ruler in a cloak, making fewer tecapus visible, as if diminishing it. In contrast, he dressed himself in a largely European-style garments. He decorated his breeches with the same asterisk-like tekapu, but then made them smaller and more numerous, as if to suggest that the cloth was more finely woven. He showed himself wearing a long-sleeved doublet with ruffled collars and cuffs, not unlike one in Moroni's portrait of a tailor. But then he also wears an indigenous tunic on top of it that's further emblazoned with numerous small motifs. Still, it's not a standard Inca period tunic. Because it was made to be worn with breeches, the garment was woven much shorter. Fashioning himself as a sort of colonial Andean dandy, Wamapoma de Ayala shows how under Spanish rule, indigenous peoples of means actively co-opted earlier forms of sartorial signification that had previously been restricted by and to the Sapa Inca. They used them to create new styles of indigenous colonial dress that equally embraced European fashions. This brings me back to the Art Institute fragments. They've most been acknowledged in scholarship for the way they were cut up. A common statement about textiles in the ancient Andes is that they were never cut, on account of how they were always woven to size, with 4 selvages, rather than being chopped from a bolt of cloth like European garments. So it's indeed quite jarring for scholars to encounter an Inca tunic in the state, almost like something out of a slasher movie. However, I don't think that their story should just be about destruction and loss. To be sure, there are other colonial Inca tunics that survive in much more complete states, which I'll introduce later. But I want to show that, quite remarkably, enough of the tunic survives in these small fragments to largely reconstruct its original appearance. Moreover, the act of doing so draws our attention to details that show how it evolved stylistically from garments like the Dumbarton Oaks tunic, thereby materially evidencing the sartorial history depicted in the colonial manuscripts. At the same time, the fragments present critical information that adds to our knowledge of these important primary sources, in turn, allowing us to better understand the original colonial tunic. We might start by considering the fragment with tecapus, as we're already familiar with these motifs. An important first step in studying a textile is to distinguish the warps from the wefts. The warps are the vertical threads that were first strung into the loom, while the wefts are the horizontal threads that were later woven in by the weaver. A handy way to remember this difference is by the horizontal lines in the letters of weft. Now, if we zoom in on this area at the top of the fragment, we can see the 2 sets of threads interacting. The vertical tan threads hanging out of the cloth are the warps. They're only visible because the wefts have deteriorated. Made of cotton, they run all the way through the cloth and are underneath its little corduroy-like ridges. The horizontal alpaca wefts are harder to see as individual threads because they're so much finer, softer, and compacted. They form the surface of the cloth on both sides and therefore create all the designs. This woven structure is called tapestry weave, and it's the same way that the Dumbarton Oaks tunic was created. The weaver laid the wefts into the warps from the bottom of the loom moving upward, going over and under each warp, row after row. The weaver had to have a separate needle or bobbin for every section of color. Even in just these 3 inches, there are some 21 different threads to juggle. Moreover, at each and every junction between colors, the weaver had to carefully interlock the 2 threads, so there wouldn't be a gap or slit in the cloth. This was labor intensive and added to the time it took to weave the designs. Now, if we zoom back out, we can see just how much work went into the tecapus, making clear that they were effective elite symbols. Moreover, we can begin to appreciate how the weaver laid them out. Remember that Wamapoma de Ayala drew tecapus repeating in diagonal lines, and that was a source of confusion for scholars that the motifs of the Dumbarton Oaks tunics were not similarly organized. In the fragment, if we isolate one tecapu, it becomes apparent that they do repeat diagonally, but skip every other row. Once a motif reached the edge of the tecapu band, the weaver cycled it back around to the other side. Thus, although Wamapoma de Ayala may not have accurately depicted the way all tecapu tunics were composed, there were Inca tunics woven with diagonal lines of tecapus, especially in the colonial period when he was illustrating his manuscript. The pattern wasn't some kind of code, but rather was bound up in the practice of weaving. The diagonal lines made the composition iterative. The weaver didn't have to plan out the whole pattern area beforehand. Instead, they could work from the previous rows to complete the subsequent ones. This iterative nature makes it possible to reconstruct missing portions of the textile. By closely studying the takapus, we can see that some are compositionally very stable, like these, making it easy to project their repetitions. In others, the weaver made small alterations to the designs. Notice how in this motif, the colors, color placements, and number of steps in the triangles changed. In this one, see how the upper left-hand corners alternate between black and brown. It's a subtle pattern, but something that the weaver devoted time and energy to. They similarly switched the colors in this motif. The sides alternate between black and tan. But then, when weaving this one, the weaver suddenly changed it, and then changed it again. It makes it hard to know what the other takapus in the sequence would have looked like. However, remember that the fragment stewarded by the Textile Museum offers us another piece of the puzzle. It only features the ladder design, suggesting that it was cut from this section, from a section of the tunic to this side of the Art Institute fragment. But notice how both the diagonal lines within the takapus and the diagonal lines that the takapus create go in opposite directions in the two fragments. This reveals yet another important characteristic of Inca tapestry weaving. Both sides of the cloth were so meticulously finished that we can't tell what the true front or back was. One of the pieces should likely be flipped over. Now, from this repetition of the takapus, we can also determine that the two fragments had to be separated by at least 5 rows of motifs. What you can likely begin to appreciate is that these takapus form the waistband of a colonial tunic, styled much like an Inca period one. The direction of the warps reveal that the whole garment was woven sideways, just like its predecessors. Critically, however, the colonial garment had many more takapus than most Inca period examples. Without an emperor to limit the number of takapus that an elite colonial man could wear, the prestigious designs proliferated. They also became somewhat smaller, at more or less an inch on each side, perhaps to insinuate fineness, just as we saw in Guamapuma's illustration. But while a lot of extra work went into creating the precious takapus themselves, the red background of the band reveals a different aspect of the weaver's approach. The colonial weavers inserted the takapus into a monochrome red grid. But this wasn't how takapus were woven in the Inca period, as evidenced by the Dumbarton Oaks tunic. You can see that originally, each takapu had its own separate border. The weavers never placed 2 takapus with the same color side by side. In order to separate the colors, they gave some motifs a double border and even had a backup border color for each motif so they could switch it if they ran into a bind. This all took a tremendous amount of thought, and of course, even more labor, since the weaver had to interlock the threads at the junctures between the colors. As another very famous colonial Inca tunic in the American Museum of Natural History in New York shows, takapus were still woven with individual borders in the early colonial period. Although the tunic bears a number of similarities to the one at Dumbarton Oaks, notably its designs also incorporate European heraldic motifs and interchange them with takapus. This is good evidence of why takapus were eventually discussed in this way in the later inventory by Philip II. Now, in contrast, the fragment's red grids were created to avoid and simplify much of this work of creating the borders around takapus. The weaver could just form each horizontal row between the takapus as a continuous red stripe. This might not seem like such an advantage, but if we condense all the takapus, we can see it meant that close to 1/4 of this heavily patterned, labor-intensive section can now just be woven in solid red, a significant reduction in work. This change in the design shows that as colonial weavers expended more energy creating greater numbers of prestigious takapus, they simultaneously sought other ways of subtly decreasing their workload. These choices about what to augment and what to cut make explicit their motivations and values. But the woven red grid also has an important bearing on the illustrated manuscripts. The very earliest depictions of The very earliest depictions of Alto Capo tunics are in Martín de Mirua's Galvan manuscript. In these watercolors, the divisions between the tecapus were painted as faint yellow grids. The result bears a decent likeness to the Dumbarton Oaks tunic, even if it's not totally accurate. I can't recall ever seeing an Inca tunic with a yellow grid, either from the Inca or colonial periods. However, it makes sense that an artist might have chosen to render an Alto Capo tunic this way, due to the difficulty of painting an individual border for each motif at these small dimensions, and the inherent danger of the pigments bleeding into each other if they weren't perfectly dry. Nonetheless, other royal portraits in the Galvan Marua very clearly show tecapus separated by red grids. For example, in the waistband tunics worn by Manco Inca and Inca Roca, these were some of the earlier Inca rulers. Manco may have even lived in the 1300s, that is, if he wasn't mytho-historical. But there's no archaeological evidence that tecapo tunics woven with red grids even existed then. Furthermore, a curious aspect of the Galvan Marua's royal portraits is that the whole set was actually cut out of another source and tipped into the manuscript. It seems likely that they were rescued from an earlier draft that Marua had created, perhaps in the 1580s, that no longer survives. I think what these portraits reveal is that, in all likelihood, as the artists worked to invent these portraits of Inca rulers, they made decisions about how to dress them, and they were looking around at what Inca nobles were wearing at that time, that is, in the 1580s or so. The garments they concocted reflect later colonial design elements like the red grids that aren't actually materially evidenced in Inca period tunics. At the same time, this allows us to hypothesize that the technique of weaving red grids was likely fully developed by the 1580s and already a prominent part of colonial Inca visual culture. If we consider the illustrations from the later Marua manuscript conserved at the Getty, which was a subsequent expanded draft of the earlier Galvan Marua, we can see that by 1615 or so, the red grids between the tecapus became even more sharply delineated, this time in a rendering of an Alto Capo tunic. If we now finally rotate the fragment, we can see that these tecapus, as they would have been oriented when they were first worn, they make clear that while this elite system of signification did not just end with the Spanish invasion, nor did it persist unchanged. What's most striking to me is this tecapu. It's likely a rendition of a very common tecapu that appeared on the Dumbarton Oaks tunic, as well as many other very standardized Inca period tunics, such as this one in the Textile Museum. What is interesting about the colonial version is that the weaver converted the diagonal line to a vertical one. Because weavers had to eyeball and freehand diagonals, this probably made it easier to lay out and weave. The artists of the Galvan Marua also apparently tried to represent this tunic in the portrait of Yara Wakak, and that I already showed you. But throughout the manuscript, they appear to have been impacted by the fact that this well-established Inca period motif had begun transforming in the colonial period. They painted it in a great variety of what seemed to be renditions of it, perhaps reflecting various versions that by that point were circulating in Inca visual culture. The weaver of the colonial tunic certainly invested the great amount of labor in the tecapu waistband. In an Inca period tunic, this might have been the only area of the garment with woven ornament, with the slight exception of tecapus where the top and bottom were different colors. But what we can appreciate from the fragments is that the garment's black backgrounds were also elaborated with rows of flowers. They look something like tulips, but their stamens and anthers suggest that they represent cantuta or cantua flowers, a blossom of great significance to the Incas and now the national flower of Peru. The unnatural colors likely evidence the weaver's interest in having multiple colorways in order to create sequences similar to their handling of the tecapus. The cantuta flower also appears in the second fragment. This piece shows us that the correct orientation of the motif, as well as how the two fragments relate to each other. Notably, there are flowers in both its black and red sections. They're oriented in different directions across the center of the piece. This makes clear that the fragment was cut from the shoulder of the tunic, as the different orientations would have allowed the flowers to remain upright on the front and back of the garment when worn. The fact that there are flowers in the black areas indicate that there were rows of cantuta flowers both above and below the Takapu waistband. This again evidences how indigenous elites in the colonial period sought degrees of ornamentation that were unseen in more austere Inca period tunics, and likely would have been prohibited under Inca rule. But what's interesting about the cantuta flowers in particular is that this motif doesn't seem to have been woven in Inca period textiles. That is, the flower was important to indigenous weavers, and they seemingly invented it as a form of indigenous cultural expression during the colonial period, perhaps in response to floral fabrics that had been imported from Europe. Finally, the cascades of small rectangles separating the black area from the red represented another important design element in colonial tunics. We've already seen it in the neck area of the tunic of the American Museum of Natural History. It also appeared in Felipe Wamampoma de Ayala's illustration of Sayri Tupac and the Galvan Marua. Indeed, all V-shaped neck tunics that were V-shaped neck tunics were frequently represented in the 3 colonial illustrated manuscripts, even if its depiction in the later Getty Marua seems somewhat poorly observed. What distinguishes this style in the material record, however, is that, like the cantuta flowers, these cascades of small rectangles around the neck only seem to appear in tunics from the colonial period. Perhaps the earliest example of it that I've located is a tunic conserved by the Museo Nacional in Lima, which I believe is unpublished, but that I was fortunately able to study before the pandemic. One side of the significantly deteriorated garment features an entirely Inca period composition, identical to the tunic in the textile museum that I showed you earlier. The other side bears a slew of features that are not usually associated with Inca period tunics scholarship, such as floral embroideries across the bottom, unusual columns of designs woven down its sides and centerline, and again, the V-shaped cascade of rectangles around its neck, in addition to the fact that the front and back of the tunic are different compositions, which is also considered a colonial period innovation. Notably, the reverse of the American Museum of Natural History tunic was woven with totally wild jaguar spots. But while indigenous weavers may have developed the cantuta flower motif as an embrace of European floral fabrics, the V-shaped cascades of rectangles do not seem to respond to European costume influences. As the checkerboard tunic showed, Inca tunics did sometimes have neck areas or yokes that were different colors, but the scale of these rectangles was much larger than the 1-inch square cascades developed in the colonial period. Moreover, in checkerboard tunics, this was simply a difference in color, not actually an elaborate design. While I admittedly don't have a clear explanation for where I think the innovation came from, I'm interested in 2 related tunics with V-shaped embellishments around their necks. One is also conserved by Dumbarton Oaks, while the other is in the Museo Nacional in Lima. They're usually described as provincial Inca tunics. Scholars use this term to characterize material culture seemingly from within the Inca Empire that demonstrates clear Inca traits, but also what appear to be regional or local features. In this case, the figures wearing crescent-shaped headdresses, which were omnipresent in textiles made by the powerful Chimu kingdom, whom the Incas conquered in the 1470s. As I stated at the start of my talk, people subjugated by the Inca empires were supposed to continue wearing their own styles of dress. But it seems possible that over time, distinct styles may have eventually converged or blended. I wonder if in the colonial period, after the fall of the Inca imperial rule and its strict regulations of dress, if a recently conquered local style may have resurged, giving rise to these cascades of rectangles around the neck. Ultimately, I think it's highly likely that the full Takapu tunic would have looked very similar to how I've drawn it here, with the missing portions rendered in grayed tones. This would make it very similar to other surviving larger fragments of colonial Inca tunics. For example, the single side of a tunic that is stewarded by the Cleveland Art Museum, or another half of a tunic in the American Museum of Natural History that is a pastiche composed of 2 separate pieces. All these garments make clear that in the colonial period, elite indigenous men came to wear styles of tunics that featured greater quantities of takapus than the earlier, more reserved Inca period ones, likely an emulation of the most important Inca vestments of all, royal tunics like the one at Dumbarton Oaks. These colonial garments incorporated new motifs like the cantuta flowers that seemingly responded to European influences, as well as design elements like the V-shaped cascades of rectangles around the neck that were perhaps reinvented from earlier regional styles. But at the same time that significant amounts of labor were invested in these new embellishments, other earlier ones like the individual borders around the takapus were gradually retired in favor of time-saving measures like the red grids. What's most important, though, is that these colonial period stylistic evolutions are registered in the manuscripts of Martin de Merua and Felipe Pombo de Ayala. The artists who worked on these manuscripts were usually trying to depict Inca period garments. But I think what these fragments show us is that they were heavily influenced by styles that they were seeing being worn in colonial Inca society as they created their illustrations between 1580 and 1615. Therefore, I think the manuscripts allow us to much more precisely date these enigmatic fragments. I think it's unlikely that they hail from as late as 1700 or 1821. Rather, the stylistic correspondences with the Galvan Merua in particular may suggest that the original tunic was woven by or sometime between 1580 and 1600. Certainly, given how quickly styles evolved after 1532, it seems unlikely that the tunic was woven as late as 1700 or 1821. However, the question remains of why the tunic was cut up. It's worth remembering the sections of diamond waistbands cut from Inca period tunics and preserved in burials. There was a long history in the Andes of saving and repurposing patterned cloth that hadn't totally outlived its usefulness. But why these shapes? They've often been described as butterflies, but I don't know how accurate that might be. There are actually a fair number of Inca objects with butterfly motifs, and they all have different, more geometric shapes. This may suggest that the pieces were not intended to resemble butterflies, at least if they were cut by an indigenous owner. But I do think that there are useful observations to make about how they were cut. Notably, while the Textile Museum fragment has a contour that's similar to the shoulder fragment conserved by the Art Institute, digitally overlapping the two pieces reveals that they're not quite identical. I think another important observation is that they all appear to have been fussy cut, to borrow a term that quilters use. That is, the pieces weren't cut to use the cloth most efficiently. Rather, the person was trying to lay out the pieces so that the woven patterns bore a significant relationship to their contours. In the case of the Jakapu fragments, they wanted the designs to fall on one half of the fragment and to be somewhat centered, especially if the person doing the cutting expected a seam margin around the outer edge. In the shoulder fragment, they similarly aligned the apex of the V with the center line of the piece. We're likely looking at pieces of cloth cut to create an unknown object. Because of the beauty of colonial Andean weavings, the labor that went into them, and their relative durability, they were sometimes used to sew other things, such as the sofa preserved at the Santa Catalina Monastery in Arequipa, Peru. The piece of furniture was made from a colonial Andean carpet or wall hanging that came to be reincarnated as upholstery fabric. The original textile was similar to this colonial Andean weaving, once sold on the website firstdibs.com, the whereabouts of which are unknown to me. Obviously, the scale of the weaving and the sofa are much larger than the tunic fragments, but their sinuous contours are reminiscent of each other and make me wonder if these pieces were cut sometime in the Victorian period, particularly the late 1800s, for a sewing project that was ultimately abandoned, causing them to eventually end up in an antique shop in New York. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, but one of the things I love about the study of objects is how they always have more stories to tell. And as we continue asking questions of them through our work at the museum, they divulge new chapters of their life histories. One of my hopes in discussing these pieces with all of you today is that someone with expertise in other kinds of objects, perhaps from a later period or another cultural tradition, might eventually recognize what they would have been used to create. In the meantime, I invite anyone currently at the Art in Chicago to take this rare opportunity to study them for yourself in the Gallery 136 of the Art Institute. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing on this rich topic. And I think we have time to turn to at least a few questions from the audience. So
Great.
Let me begin by asking you about some of the colors that we saw in the slides. They're so incredibly well preserved. Would you be able to speak a little bit about or to how the Incas prepared the colors for these textiles?
Absolutely, yeah. We know that all these rich colors were natural dyes, vegetable dyes often. And the crimson is probably one of the most famous dyes that came out of the New World, the quote unquote New World. It was a dye called cochineal that had been, it's a parasitic insect that grows on a puntia cactus. And was one of the most intense red dyes that had really ever circulated in human history, far surpassing any of the dyes that had existed in Europe to that point. So after the Spanish invasions, it became one of the most lucrative exports that were brought back to Europe and largely displaced and replaced a lot of the red dyes used in Europe. Some of the other dyes, we're still sort of doing a lot of dye work in the field, trying to figure out what they might have been. A lot of the dye knowledge that communities have was displaced with the introduction of aniline dyes eventually. And so a lot of really great weaving cooperatives since the 1990s have been working to reconstruct a lot of that dye knowledge in indigenous communities in the Cusco region.
Thank you. The composite textiles like the cotton and the alpaca, were they more common than ones just made of one material?
It's a great question. So the use of different fibers, mixing the two fibers in different ways, can relate to two different things. On the one hand, it can be the regional variation. So cotton is grown on the coast, and it's a coastal crop. So we have a lot more cotton textiles that often are on the coast of the Andes, whereas alpacas and camelids live in the mountains. So a lot of highland textiles are more often woven with camelid fiber, but they also have very different properties. So alpaca actually carries the dyes much better. The dyes come out much more vibrant with alpaca fiber, and the cotton fiber actually is sort of less elastic and less stretchy than the camelid fibers. So as a result of that, it can make a really great warp. So a lot of the colonial textiles that we see in a lot of Inca tunics sometimes have cotton warps within the camelid wefts. So the bright colors that you're weaving can be as vibrant as possible with the camelid and the warp, but then in the weft, but then the warp ends up being sturdier from the cotton fibers.
Thank you. And then there was a question about whether or not the variations in the motifs that are in a single garment could indicate that multiple weavers were involved in the creation of that. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, this is a really great question and something that I've explored a lot with the Dumbarton Oaks tunic. It is possible that, on a very wide loom, because these were woven horizontally, there's actually a lot of shoulder width that multiple weavers could potentially have sat in front of the loom at the same time. So as a result of that, you can actually get sort of different hands, and the way in which a weaver might have woven it might have been different from the partner who they might have worked with. And so multiple weavers might have sat in front of a loom in order to be able to raise the cloth across the width of it, this very wide width, in a simultaneous fashion. So we might have that kind of differences between the patterns as a result of that. Unfortunately, in this case, our fragments are so small that it's hard to know sort of the whole breadth of the tunic and to be able to make that kind of comparison from one side to the other. But it's a great possibility. And I mean, there's also the question of, do other portions of this tunic survive elsewhere? Are there other museums that we don't know about that might also have pieces of this, or private collections? So hopefully talking about these textiles today, might raise awareness of the pieces themselves.
I was actually going to ask you if you know about any other museums that would have these fragments, but instead, let me ask you if you have an idea of whether any of these fragments have been exhibited together.
They haven't yet, to my knowledge. The identification that the other set was in the Textile Museum, I believe Anne Rowe made in the 1980s. And so since then, it would be a great opportunity to bring them together. And also bring them together with other colonial Inca tunics to sort of show what they would have looked like as a whole.
Let me ask you two more questions, and then I don't want to take up everyone's evening, but is it possible to carbon date these objects to better determine their dates of origin?
It's a good question. As a more recent object, depending on when they were made, we might be able to get a better carbon-14 reading. One of the challenges that we often have in carbon dating Inca period objects is that there are sort of discrepancies in the carbon curves at that exact era. And so there's also sort of multiple peaks. And so it can be difficult from us sometimes when interpreting C14 dates for Inca objects. Sometimes you'll get two different dates with equal probability. And if those, if those are far apart or close together, or on one side of the invasion, the Spanish invasion, or the other, it can be difficult for us sometimes to know exactly how to interpret it.
And then what questions do you ask yourself when you're examining these fragments? And what do you hope visitors would notice and ask of themselves when they see these in Gallery 136?
I hope that, the opportunity to view them, and we've worked to bring the textiles much closer to the glass so that one can actually look at them, close and actually see these threads. My hope is that, in hopefully what you've taken away from the talk today is indeed how labor intensive these were and how much skill and technique went into doing this weaving. So I do hope that when people come see these in the galleries, they can look at these minutely fine threads and see the labor that went into it and think about the person behind it, think about the artist who was doing this work and what they were trying to achieve, and also just how long it would have taken. This was really slow work and really painstaking work and really skilled work. And so I do hope that that's something that, in coming into the galleries and seeing it, those are the kinds of things that you just can't appreciate from the photograph on your screen. You really have to have that sort of firsthand experience. So I hope that you all take the opportunity.
Awesome. I'd like to thank you again, Andrew, for giving this wonderful talk that I'm sure was also very labor intensive for you to produce. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this evening's program. We hope you enjoyed this presentation and have a chance to visit some of these objects in Gallery 136 on view through spring of this year. For more information on upcoming virtual events, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.